Andrew Williamson here. Welcome back to Williamson Education. In our most recent lesson on redundancy, I ended with a brief reflection on the words of the 20th century American novelist Ernest Hemingway. Specifically, I suggested that we all have something to learn from Hemingway's reticence, his quietude, his withholding of language. Well, the topic of today's class continues on that same theme of not saying more than you have to say. Both redundancy and today's topic, wordiness, have to do with avoiding superfluous or unnecessary language. Like redundancy, wordiness is not necessarily a grammatical error per se, but it is a stylistic flaw to be avoided. Let's learn more about what wordiness is and how to avoid it. Our guiding spirit for today is one of someone who lived around the same time as Hemingway did, the famous and problematic American president Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt famously captured his theory of power in a succinct saying. He said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Whatever you think of Roosevelt, whether you admire him or revile him, his words are wise in this instance. The basic meaning here is that speaking softly is a form of exercising power, much like carrying a big stick. In fact, according to Roosevelt, the ability to speak softly is an important counterpart to physical strength. Today, we'll discuss the topic of wordiness. To be clear, wordiness, like redundancy, is bad. Wordiness is what Theodore Roosevelt would advise you to avoid at all costs. Wordiness is essentially a flaw in English style that arises when speakers and writers use more words than they have to express a given idea. As I mentioned in our last class, English language stylists generally favor an economy of phrasing. This means that they prefer efficient uses of language. You should avoid using more words than are necessary to express your thoughts at any given moment. When you use more words than are necessary, you have written a so-called wordy sentence. Now, I will confess, my wordiness tracker on my own word processing software often flags me for wordiness. I myself am not immune from the temptations of more words. And wordiness can creep into my sentences very slyly without my realizing it. It takes a careful attention to detail and often a sharp editor's pen to ensure that your sentences aren't wordy. Let's take a look at a couple of wordy sentences so that you can see what I mean by the idea and so that you can get some sense of how to correct wordiness issues. I'll give you a sentence with an especially strong wordiness here so that you can see, I hope, that wordiness jumps out at you. Here's my example sentence. At this point in time, it would appear highly likely that the event scheduled for this evening will be canceled due to the fact that rain is supposed to affect a large number of towns in the area. Now, as I mentioned with redundancy, wordiness is not necessarily a grammatical error per se. I have not made any technical mistakes in the sentence that I've just spoken, but there are ways to improve the flow and style of the sentence by eliminating unnecessary words. Wordiness is more of a style issue than a grammar issue, and we definitely want you to have style, now don't we? Often, correcting wordiness issues revolves around replacing, say, a 4 or 5 word phrase with a single word. In my example sentence, there are several phrases that we can condense into 1 or 2 words. Take the opening phrase, for instance. At this point in time, it can easily become now. Or take the phrase, due to the fact that. This phrase can easily become because. How about a large number of? That phrase can become many. Even that intensifier highly seems quite wordy to my ear. It can probably be eliminated as redundant. The combination of these changes will make a much leaner sentence structure. We can take these several phrases from the sentence and distill them into simpler structures. Now, in order for the new sentence to flow well, we may need to rearrange some elements. Don't be afraid to move items around when necessary. I like to think of writing sentences as playing a word puzzle. You have to choose the correct words, and then you have to place them in the right order. Sometimes that process of finding the correct order requires some trial and error. I would write the revised sentence as follows. It now appears likely that the event scheduled for tonight will be canceled because of the rain that will affect many towns in the area. See that? Much better. My original sentence had 36 words. My revised sentence has just 25. Just by the numbers alone, we can see that we have a much more efficient sentence in my revision. And what did I lose in the ideas of the sentence? Absolutely nothing. Same ideas, many fewer words. That's a sentence win all around. Why say more words than you have to say? Let's take a look at a second example and try our hands at another correction. Here's my next example of wordiness. In the majority of relevant cases, you will find that children have the ability to control their emotions in spite of the fact these emotions may seem uncontrollable. Which phrases do I identify as being wordy in this sentence? In the majority of cases seems like a good candidate for a revision to my mind. Why not just usually? The same goes for have the ability to. That phrase can be condensed to some version of the verb can. Finally, in spite of the fact that also has an easy alternative in fewer words, despite works well. I would also add here that varying word choice is an important consideration to keep in mind. Generally speaking, we want to avoid using the same word or words near each other in sentences and paragraphs. Did you notice how my example sentence uses versions of the word control twice in short order? I would also bet that we can change one of these two words to a synonym that will preserve the meaning of the sentence while varying diction or word choice. So, with all of these goals in mind, let's look at a revision. Here are my corrections with some words and ideas shifted around slightly to preserve the flow of the sentence. Here it is. You will find that children can usually control their emotions despite the fact that these emotions may seem unmanageable. That's much better. The original sentence has 29 words, while my revision has just 19. We've cut out a third of the words in the sentence while preserving the original meaning, clarifying ideas, and varying our word choice to boot. That's another sentence win. In the last 4 classes, we have been looking at problems that can arise in the construction of sentences. We have touched on run-on sentences, fragments, redundancy, and now wordiness. There is one common theme across the classes that I would like to highlight to you: the importance of writing. As we have seen time and again, errors of grammar and style that might be acceptable in speech are not allowed in writing. This means that when you are writing in English, you have to pay particular attention to the kinds of issues that I've raised in these last 4 lectures. Writing might therefore seem like a greater risk than speaking. After all, when you make a mistake in writing, it remains there for everyone to see. And yes, you have to be particularly careful not to make mistakes when you are writing. But you might also look at the issue another way. Writing in English is an opportunity to practice avoiding the errors and stylistic weaknesses that we have just been discussing. When you write, you don't necessarily need to write to someone, or at least you don't need to send your writing to anyone. I write for myself all the time. I don't necessarily share my writing with anyone. You can do the same, and in the process, you can practice correcting run-ons, fragments, redundancies, and wordiness. Over time, you may even become a trusted editor for other people's writing. As a general rule, English language writers adopt a less is more approach to style in our language. This means that, like the soft-speaking Theodore Roosevelt, you should aim to reduce the number of words that you use in your sentences. Of course, there is such a thing as going too far with this rule. We don't want a global society of silent English speakers, but we do want you to find efficient solutions to your language needs. Somehow, and I don't claim to know exactly why, saying fewer words often communicates more and more powerfully than saying more. Keep this rule in mind as you speak and write throughout the English-speaking world. Well, with that, we conclude our unit on what could go wrong in English language sentences. We'll pick up next time with a unit on punctuation. Stay tuned and spread the word.